Hello, this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by my co-host Logos and a special guest Charlemagne. And I think Charlemagne, you had me on with Dave, about 3 or 4 months ago to discuss the Moldbug Matrix. We were about halfway through 2007, and I thought it'd be a really cool idea to sort of discuss with you your whole journey out of the Moldbug Matrix. So, where were you politically before you found Moldbug?
Well, Moldbug was kind of my turn to the proper right, I would say. When I found Moldbug, I was pretty much in full MAGA Trump mode. Trump was president. I, supported him pretty strongly in his campaign and as president, but obviously, something was seriously wrong by the year 2017 in terms of his presidency. So I was kind of looking for answers to like why this wasn't working like it was supposed to, like it was advertised, basically. So that's where I was when I found Moldbug.
All right. So, what about Moldbug attracted you to his brand of the right?
Well, there was I read his entire open letter to open-minded progressives, which I don't think you've gotten to yet. I think you got to the first part of it actually. Um, that's kind of his seminal work in terms of his unqualified reservations blog, I think. And honestly, it was like one paragraph in I think part 8 of that letter that really put me over the edge of like being like, okay, this guy understands what's going on. And there's some paragraph in like part 7 or 8 that actually talks about um, I can't remember the Republican politician, but there was some crazy Republican politician back in Moldbug's time. I think he was like a some sort of Christian Republican or whatever, and he talks about how this guy could run and he could act like batshit crazy. Is how that campaign would go, and that's sort of one way of running as a Republican. And he kind of more or less described how Trump campaigned, and so I found in a sense he was like predicting not only Trump's campaign style but also what would happen. And I just sort of found it really compelling. I found his whole diagnosis of how power in the United States works really compelling. In particular, like how Moldbug describes the media, how he describes the United States as a press-controlled state. And I think if you were, living through the 2015 to 2017 era, the concept of a press-controlled state was, just hearing those words articulated like that really opened a lot of windows for me, because that sort of phrase, and I think I even say this in my video way back in the day, that sort of phrase is just not in our lexicon, right? You can talk about state controlled religion, a religion controlled state, a state controlled press, but the idea of a press controlled state is a very foreign idea. And I think ultimately that idea is actually incorrect. I think it's pretty been well demonstrated that the the media does not run the state. The finance interests primarily run the state. But nevertheless, at the time, it was a very compelling thing to see written.
Now, so the last essay he wrote for unqualified reservations was in 2016, and then he started Gray Mirror in 2020. And would it be fair to say that it was in that window where he wasn't really writing anything new that you sort of started to really gain traction with Moldbug?
Absolutely. That window was actually when I started getting into Moldbug, and really he more or less stopped writing in like 2010. I think he had a few minor posts since then, but yeah, he had stopped writing completely. As far as my perspective was, he was just this sort of archaic right wing thinker who had just all but disappeared and we'd never hear from him again. But he had some really interesting ideas. So I just sort of took to popularizing those ideas along with a few other people. And then, yeah, he suddenly just reappeared on the stage, which was quite jarring. And we can get into in your next line of questioning.
Well, yeah, but as to your channel, in fact, your channel was in fact started in part to express and expose people to Moldbug's ideas, correct?
More or less, I had had a YouTube channel, for probably like 8 years at that point, because I had just made one, back when YouTube started becoming popular, not for political reasons, but just for uploading random videos and stuff. And then around the 2015, when politics started getting really crazy, I felt an urge to do something to try and contribute or help. And eventually, I found my niche with the Moldbug videos. So I would consider my first Moldbug video like the proper start of the channel where I sort of figured out what I'm doing. And that's really, the keystone of my entire channel was that series explaining Moldbug in the context of Trump's campaign and presidency.
All right. So when did you start souring on Moldbug? I know a lot of people did when he wrote in Gray Mirror his Hobbits versus Dark Elves essay.
Well, it was kind of a process. I mean, when he came back with his Clear Pill blogs, I think for the American Mind, those hit weirdly. He was sort of summarizing his ideas that he had written in Unqualified Reservations in an even more simplistic way than you are put it. But there was this sort of undertone of inaction being pushed in his Clear Pill blogs in particular. And a lot of people found that jarring and off-putting. I really stumped for Moldbug still at that point, and I was kind of on board with his Clear Pill stuff, which is basically the idea of just sort of seeing through politics, sort of viewing politics as if you were like an expat living in a foreign country and not becoming like emotionally tied or really tied in any way to any particular ideology. I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty standard, Machiavellianism type stuff. But something was always nagging at me at the back of my mind about the whole Clear Pill idea and how once he started Gay Mirror, like almost all of his blogs seem to be oriented towards like inaction, like don't do anything, because if the right does stuff that triggers the left and it provides them energy, and then they just oppress you more, and the best thing you can do is kind of just not engage in politics, which is kind of confounding because it sort of leaves you in this position where you're basically being advised that any action you possibly could take is counterproductive, and yet you still want to try and take some sort of action. And by action, I don't even mean like, going to some sort of a rally or something, but even just like producing YouTube videos or something like that. So that really rubbed people the wrong way, including me. And then eventually we got to his infamous Dark Elves essay. And, that's where I just sort of completely heel turned on Moldbug and I haven't really been a fan of Moldbug ever since then, because I think that essay was a big mistake on his part where he sort of revealed his real class interests. You guys have sort of sussed out what Moldbug really is in a very complete and engrossing way in your series, but Yarvin sort of made the mistake of revealing it in a very simple way in that blog. And so it's not just that one blog that, turned me off of him, the Dark Elves blog. I think people can get that impression sometimes of myself or others who have sort of turned against Moldbug, but it was really more of a process, that started with his Clear Pill essays. And by the time he started writing about his Dark Elves, I just gotten completely fed up with him.
Now, this is something I don't want to get too far ahead, but this is something that Logos and I have pointed out after his interview with Orrin McIntyre. Literally everything in that interview that people didn't like was in 2007 UR. But what I want to say here is, as from hearing the progression, that it would seem, and tell me if you think this is a fair characterization or not, the time was just so different back in 2007 to 10, the Bush years, the early Obama years, that as society has moved beyond that, even though Moldbug hasn't really changed what he believes, it just has aged very poorly relative to the meta of this country. And that when he first came on the scene at the beginning of the computer revolution, it seemed like, the next hot thing, but that's because there was a sort of contingent factor to it.
Well,
yeah, can you say that again? Did we lose Charlie?
No, I'm here. My mute is just lagging. Yes, so at the time, Yarvin's work seemed very novel and way ahead of its time. And I guess it was, to be fair. But yeah, you're right. After the Trump era, what he is writing about doesn't really map to the way politics is going anymore. Because Trump sort of reset the game in a sense. Yarvin was writing before when all manner of right-wing dissident politics just fail again and again and again. Things like Buchanan, the old Dixiecrats. We can bring libertarians. None of this stuff works at all in terms of changing the power structure. But what Trump did was sort of give us a more. He sort of opened the door to postmodernism.
Yeah, hold up, Charlie. The chat says you're roboting out pretty bad. Is there anything we can do on that?
Yeah, let me switch my phone. Give me like 30 seconds.
Sure. Okay, chat, we're on it. We're working on it. Somebody says here, end credits. Charlemagne is being absorbed into the machine. No. Well, let's look at the chat. We have Cyber Ninja Zero, Record Deepness, GF, Evidence Violates Community Guidelines, Arum, Chiron God Emperor, and the end of credits. Hello.
Hey, all right, how's that?
Oh, much better. Could you just start the whole line of questioning over again? Or response, I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, when Yarvin first started writing back in 2007, I mean, the stuff he was writing was fairly visionary, I would say, just in terms of the level of analysis he was providing for just why right-wing politics were not working. Whether you're talking about Buchanan or libertarianism or any of this stuff, none of these movements worked at all. And it was all kind of the same reason that they didn't work, which was that, you had this media apparatus that could basically control all of the information flow about what these things were. But Trump sort of changed the game a bit. Whatever you may think of him, he introduced this sort of postmodern politics to America and really upset he changed the horizon of what one could do in politics in order to get one's message out or advance some particular interest. So I think Moldbug's writings are very much still constrained by a sort of authentic modernist type of politics, whereas when you start getting into a postmodern style of politics like Trump does, where he sort of breaks down all the barriers of respectability and even just literally lies and makes things up even, this sort of changes the game to what's available. And just also the type of organizing we've done on the internet since 07, 08, 09, since Moldbug was writing has opened up a lot of opportunities to us as well. So I think Moldbug's recommendations, people sort of treat them as gospel, and I don't see any reason to treat them that way. They were definitely applicable just a few years ago, but I don't really see any reason to listen to the guy at this point when he's basically telling us to not do anything, even though it's pretty clear we have significant material successes going forward at this point. I mean, and you can just look at the Supreme Court. I mean, I think the decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court kind of totally BTFO Moldbug, especially the affirmative action win, because that does strictly meet his definition of what a victory is. A victory is something that makes future victories more likely, which the affirmative action overturn obviously does, because it makes it that much more easy to get our type of people in the door, because this is one less barrier in the way. So,
right. So, in your sort of coming to terms with the fact that Moldbug maybe wasn't what you thought he was, as you were increasingly disillusioned, how did you find the series that Logos and I are doing on Moldbug, and how did that influence you?
That's a good question. I don't remember how I found it. I mean, I think I was already following you because somehow I had become aware of your debates with the libertarians, and I just thought they were the best things ever because you just totally tore them apart in a way that I've never seen anyone do before. I think it might have been actually Stephen Carson who had recommended me one of those debates, because I recall engaging with that Stephen Kinsella guy on Twitter. And I was like, wow, I really don't like this person. He's like a total asshole. What can I find out about him? And then I think I may have come across your content through that route. And of course I had watched the Tom Woods show to some extent, especially during my more libertarian phase. Not that I ever was a libertarian, but I was sort of leaning in that direction. So I might have seen you on there as well. So I was kind of already engaging with your content to a light degree before you released that. And then of course, once I saw that that your video about Moldbug popped up in my feed, I was like, oh, let me check this out, because basically nobody is criticizing Moldbug at this point, not even just in a, and I mean criticizing in a very literal sense, not even in a hostile way. Like, the microscope has not been applied to this guy, and it needs to be applied to this guy, because you two coined this phrase in your series called the Moldbug haunted right, and we're very much haunted by Moldbug's ideas. I see a lot of his ideas, sort of peddled about as these one-liners, and people don't even realize that this came from Yarvin, and we should at least know where our ideas are coming from. Now, I always knew Moldbug wasn't a right-winger. He was, if anything, Moldbug's always been consistent and open and clear about what he is, which is a progressive. He's never hidden that. That being said, I mean, I always thought, his advice or his sort of analysis was useful. Just like you could take you could take Lenin, for example, and you can realize that, Lenin's a communist, but there still might be some interesting things that Lenin has to say especially about organizing. So you can learn from him. But I think a lot of people mistakenly view Yarvin still as some sort of right winger, which he definitely isn't.
Yeah. So real quickly, Logos, do you have any questions for Charlie or anything you want to add?
Oh, hi. I've just been writing some notes in the background while I've been talking. I got a few. I didn't know when would be the best time to bring them up was, but if we're segueing. So the first question I had was, when you think about Moldbug's later articles and you think about his earlier articles, one connection that struck me for this whole thing is it seems that Moldbug exists purely to stop like a Weimar Germany backlash from forming on the right, more so than he exists to, I don't know, cement any particular kind of politics or put forth any type of vision himself. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair analysis. I mean, basically all of his blogging since 2020, when he came back, has been oriented towards getting right-wingers to just sort of do nothing. Not to get them to do anything particular, but just do nothing. And he never addresses the left. And he sort of lays out a model in which one could be on the right and do some sort of activism, but I can't even really describe it because he's so unclear about what that really means. I think he uses terms like a dissident operative or something like that. So yeah, I mean, Moldbug's whole thing is to get right-wingers to not do anything. I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing that struck me when you guys were talking, so in 2007, in one of his earlier articles, he said that he doesn't want the right coalition to win when he's talking about the caste system. I believe what he said exactly was something like the right wing, the OVA group on the right. They're not very intellectual. They're terrible at politics. And he said it's a very good thing they're terrible at politics because he'd probably not want to live in the country if they won. I mean, given that, how do people take Moldbug as some kind of like a right-wing figure when he's been so blatantly on the record about how much he disdains like the very base that makes up right-wing politics?
Yeah, well, most people just haven't read Moldbug. I mean, I think a lot of people have only watched my videos or only read his sort of major pieces, like the open letter to open-minded progressives, and they haven't gone into the deep cuts. And if you do go into the deep cuts, he does state very clearly things like this, where, yeah, I don't want these guys to win because we're not on the same team. And he even, this thing you just mentioned with the OVA and whatever the other acronyms were, he talks about this in his Coriolanus and the Conservatives essay, where he sort of frames himself as a Coriolanus. And in that essay as well, he makes it very clear that he doesn't want the Volscians to win. He just hates the elite ruling class of Rome, which he's ostensibly a part of, and wants to ally with these people and overturn it. But he in no way has the same worldview or interest in them. His only mutual interest with the right is really just to the extent to where they can help him do his little reset scenario and get this sort of corporate government in place. But yeah, I mean, again, he's always clear on this. You don't have to read between the lines. He says it outrightly that he's not a right winger. He doesn't want the right to win. He doesn't even like the right. They are just the natural opposing force to the current form of the left, which he doesn't like.
That's a really good essay to cite. Yeah, I remember me and Todd reading that essay and just being stricken by like how crazy that that whole picture he painted was. So the last question I had written down here was, you mentioned that you thought that Moldbug was a progressive. Now, I think me and Todd, when we read Moldbug, we get the idea that he's just more of like a Stirnerite libertarian, in the sense that he thinks like corporate dystopia is like some kind of inevitability, so he wants it to happen sooner rather than later, and he just wants people to know who's really in charge, which doesn't strike me as like a really progressive thing to think. Like Moldbug doesn't strike me as an egalitarian or somebody who's big on racial quotas and things like that. He thinks whatever the rules the corporation set are good. What do you think the relationship is between libertarianism and progressivism? Do you mean it more like a socially liberal sense, or how do you make the connection?
Socially liberal, I mean, I really mean as pedigree, because he uses the word progressive, I think, to describe his parents. He uses the word communist to describe his grandparents. So basically his pedigree is of the hard left in some capacity, be it literal communist or socially liberal people that you might call progressives. He's certainly he's certainly a corporate libertarian, and the Stirnerism that you've identified in him is actually pretty unique, and I haven't seen anyone identify that before, which I couldn't because I haven't read Stirner. But yeah, he's not a progressive in like the very literal sense. It's his pedigree.
That makes sense. Cool. That was all I had written down for now, so you can keep asking questions, Todd.
Yeah. So, Logos and I did the 3 videos at the end of the series before the event that I met you at in Tennessee, Charlemagne. Did you get a chance to see those 3 videos where we sort of sum up our case against Moldbug?
I think I did, but I don't know. You'd have to re-articulate it because so much has happened since then.
No, that's fine. Yeah, because I kind of want to get your take of the meta where we're at now. So where we're at now for Moldbug is that Moldbug is trying to, quote, seduce somebody, but it's not the Brahmins on the left. He's already stated he's one of them. It's that he's trying to seduce those on the right to do nothing. So, for example, after the Hobbits versus Elves, I also read some when we covered that article in our series, we also looked at some responses, and Raging Mandrill did a response, and he put up a very good response. If we do nothing and just let immigration continue, then our side is doomed to lose. And obviously Moldbug knows this. So and when Raging Mandrill said our side, he means the right. So clearly that's sus. There's the connection to the deep state that he hints at. In 2007, he says, oh yeah, when the news and the CFR agree on something, you have to listen because that's where the real people are. And then like literally a month later, he's like, oh yeah, I have like this relative in the CFR. Like, listen to me. I'm connected to the, I'm close to the centers of decision making. It's really odd that this follows right after he said, oh yeah, the CFR is the canary in the coal mine. And then there was an interesting essay by Brian Doherty in Reason Magazine about Peter Thiel, where he says that Peter Thiel is closely connected to Milo Yiannopoulos and Moldbug. He claims that he got this from emails that were acquired by BuzzFeed. Again, I haven't seen the emails, but assuming that he's a reputable reporter, and I think a lot of people on the right who have libertarian leanings would probably accept that Brian Doherty is a reasonable reporter. That's interesting. Well, what might that connection be, and how does that suss out? Okay, so there's that, and then there's also he's shielding corporations all throughout 2007. He's complaining about the socially progressive aspects of America, but all of these socially progressive aspects are the result of corporate funding. You can read E. Michael Jones's Libido Dominandi. The Rockefellers are behind Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute and all of that, right? You've got all these other initiatives which either have deep state backing. So, for example, Gloria Steinem was at one point a CIA asset. You have a lot of rock and roll stars who had dads in the military. So, for example, Jim Morrison of the Doors. His father was in the Navy, but not just in the Navy. He was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Like this is some weird, deep state corporate stuff. And Moldbug is blaming absolutely the wrong people for this. The academics in the university, which many of them got fired in 2020 for not towing the party line. which shows that they don't have power. So he's shielding corporations and yet complaining about their results, i.e. progressive culture, even though it's directly tied to the corporations. And then I guess the last thing we talked about was that Moldbug is actually an agent provocateur seeking to incite violence, the young chimp, old chimp, Schrodinger's chimp, as Logos calls it, and his changing definitions of formalism, which indicate that he's actually trying to create an uncertainty, which he says will lead to some sort of violence. That's sort of where we were at, summarizing 2007.
Okay, I remember that. I think the last bit might be a little too much there in terms of, I mean, maybe he is really that clever and intelligent that he's setting up this really like this 20-year op where he's sowing uncertainty in order to cause violence, and in this exact way he tells us in the blog. I don't really buy that, but sowing uncertainty is something he does. I guess he does it on purpose. I mean, I don't see how he couldn't, because a few months ago I was trying to do a blog post about, I think, neocameralism or something, and I was like, let me go refresh myself on the exact technical definition of neocameralism, and I found like neocameralism is this, neocameralism is formalism, neocameralism is that. There are like 5 different definitions for it, and I was like, well, what the hell, man? Like, I can't actually. He sort of makes his claims unaddressable because he can just change the definition of anything at will. Going back to the first thing you said, I think, yes, absolutely, he has seduced the right. This is a very typical sort of leftist thing where they tell you what they're going to do to you and then they do it, or they like claim that the other party is doing it. So you see this a lot with the American government, where they project all the bad things they're doing onto like someone like Vladimir Putin, for example. Like, they accuse Putin of all the same things that they're doing. And Yarvin's following like a similar train where he's like, yes, we're going to seduce the left, but in reality he's just seducing the right. And I think it's clear that they are seduced, because when you talk to people about Moldbug's ideas, it's pretty rare to actually see Moldbug's cases for things, like particularly the inaction, presented in some sort of logical, argumentative way. He's more or less just cited. Like, Moldbug said this. Like, Moldbug said that, you don't want to quote unquote flex power, whatever that means, because if you flex power, that like triggers the leftists and it agitates them and then makes them come after you even harder. And it's like, okay, well, I can see how that's not entirely unreasonable, but you haven't actually like demonstrated anything. Like, you can just assert that you shouldn't flex power because you're going to trigger leftists and then they're going to attack you. But like, how do we know that's always going to happen anytime you flex power, whatever that exact phrase even means? So there's all these sorts of ways where he sort of tricked people into just thinking that all these sort of neologisms that he's come up with are just sort of de facto true, despite not really actually demonstrating them. And that was one of the most interesting things about the whole series, is you sort of demonstrate in your series that he never actually completes almost any of the arguments he makes. Like, he says, I'm going to show how X, Y, Z, and then he just goes off in direction W and just doesn't actually prove any of X, Y, or Z, and starts talking about unrelated things. But then by the time you get to the end of the essay, you like feel like you have been convinced of X, Y, and Z because of the way he writes, which is kind of like what seduction is. It's not logical. It's a feeling he puts you under. And okay, you also said like 2, 3, and 4. I don't remember which things they were, but I think those are the big ones. Is the seduction is absolutely spot on, and uncertainty is key to how he operates, because you can't just claim to be like a formalist or a neocameralist or a neo-monarchist and not even have an actual definition for those things. I mean, any honest person I engage with, if they call themselves one of these things or have an ism, they can define the ism, they can define it clearly multiple times across different periods of times, and it's always the same thing, roughly. It's not like 5 totally different, completely things in the span of a few months. So anyway, I'll pass it back to y'all.
Yeah, the other point was, I don't know if you covered this, connections to shadowy sources like either the CFR or Peter Thiel or someone else entirely.
Yeah, I mean, he constantly like puts this forward. Even back in his old blogs, he talks about his parents were like State Department people. He's always leaning on his sort of pedigree to be like, hey, look at me, take me seriously. I'm like connected to power. I know how it operates. I name drop Peter Thiel. I've been to his house or something, but it's like it's never actually clear to what extent he actually has a relation with these people. My feeling is that there's no sort of like dark elf conspiracy thing going on. I think Moldbug is only loosely connected to these people in power, like he's been to their house parties a few times, and he just names drops them for clout, basically. I don't think if there's a sort of a angle here where there's some sort of plan going on with these people. I think he can just name drop them at will and not be refuted. It's not even possible to refute, and it's not even wrong as far as I can tell. Like, Moldbug has been to people like Thiel's house and various parties and stuff, and he is kind of in with these people, but he's not in with them in the same way like someone like Julius Evola was not in with like Mussolini, right? He's this very tangential figure that has maybe met them a few times, but I don't actually think Moldbug is. I think Moldbug exaggerates his connection to the elites, which I think is demonstrated pretty well by his sort of like fairly middling software career.
So to run with the seduction analogy, it's like a guy who knows the kind of people that the woman he's into likes and knows them very generally and just pretends that he's chumming with all these people. Is that
exactly?
Okay.
I mean,
go ahead.
People tend to do that, right? That's a fairly that's not even a weird thing to do to if you're trying to seduce a woman or just kind of make your way into social circles to sort of like pretend like you have a bit more clout already than you actually do. So I kind of lean towards that explanation.
So the other takeaway, I guess, too, is the whole Puritan thesis that Moldbug resurrects and reinterprets is really an entire screen to deflect from the JQ. That's pretty clear in his essay, Why I'm Not an Anti-Semite. He's really mad at Kevin McDonald, who is getting too close to his comfort. And I bring this up because it gets into what Logo said earlier in the stream. This is trying to deflect from a Weimar reaction. And I think that whole arc, that Why I'm Not an Anti-Semite kind of opens into the Puritan thesis, is an interesting deflection.
I think Moldbug is very scared of violence. And I think that's partly why I don't think that he's trying to cause violence from the right by layering this uncertainty. I think if there's one thing that's sort of present throughout his entire essay series, it's that he's deathly afraid of any sort of violence happening, especially from the right. And I even sort of mentioned this in the talk I gave at the Shieldings event, where I talk about how he concocts this ridiculous reset scenario, basically, where like all power transitions without any violence from military or other forces whatsoever. So, I think given the history of quote unquote anti-Semitism, at least in the standard history of it, and also the fact that Yarvin himself is a Jew, I think he feels that he needs to. Obviously he has his own personal reasons to direct people away from certain facts about those people, regardless of whether or not they're true or not. He has too much of a vested interest, like people of his kind do, to be honest about what's happening there.
Right. So on the one hand, when Logos and I sort of summarize our positions and talk about this sort of maximal interpretation of Moldbug, part of this is when we started the series, if we had just treated Moldbug as somebody who was just a dumb person that wrote online, the immediate criticism would have been, well, that's not fair-minded, that's not fair. Moldbug is a lot smarter than that. I guess, being accused of viewing Moldbug as smarter than he is, and he's not quite the evil overlord in the Dark Tower that he thinks he is the reason why I'm doing that, though, is saying, like, okay, if there is any sort of reason or consistency here, what would be the best explanation? Maybe there isn't, but it would be more parsimonious to assume that there is. And so that's sort of why Logos, at least I'm taking that sort of attack. It could just be the more mundane answer is correct. And I wouldn't be opposed to that necessarily. But I'm just saying that I'm trying to find any logical connections if there are any.
Yeah, well, there could be. I mean, I think that's what your approach has really brought in terms of value, is this critique of Moldbug, or just reading of Moldbug as if you had never heard of him before, which, as far as I know, you haven't, neither of you have actually read him before. So it's doubly good, but he hasn't been treated this way by anybody. Everything he's written since his comeback has been treated based on this aura he's built up, this sort of mystique he's built up, partially, due to the fault of people like myself. But it's just weird because any philosopher or historian, you're always going to consider their work this way. You're going to consider what their motivations are. You're going to consider, their familial context, their historical context, all of these sorts of things. But Yarvin just gets given this benefit of the doubt that goes sort of above and beyond. I mean, I don't even see any particular reason to give him that, because it's not like Yarvin is some sort of great figure who's done some sort of amazing work for the right wing or something, and simply because of like all of the great things he's done for us, like, we're willing to give him some slack. I mean, what has he actually done to not warrant this sort of deep criticism that we levy at him? I mean, you do the same to the opposite side too. Like, a lot of us treat people like Foucault and Derrida like pretty seriously, because we're just interested in a fair and honest analysis of the various philosophies and ways of understanding the world that are presented to us. And if you look at Yarvin's, I mean, it's not even really consistent. Like, I'm not even sure what Yarvin's description of the world actually is, because it's just so cloudy.
Yeah, and to your point about people giving Moldbug the benefit of the doubt, at the event, when I sort of gave, because most people there knew me for the Moldbug series, so I got a lot of questions from the Anons about that series. One of the things that I was trying to get them to see was, there's a case that's been made cumulatively by the research Logos and I have done. And, anybody who's not fully convinced of that case, to what extent is that because A, the case is incomplete, or B, because there's a nostalgia for Moldbug that people kind of are reticent to accept certain conclusions? I think B is often what was going on. And I was trying to get people to be like, well, look, just step back a little bit, pretend this isn't Moldbug, pretend you don't have any special attachment, and just look at the facts. What conclusions might you draw from what Logos and I have discovered? And in that regard, I think for me, the meetup was a success. But I think that's ultimately what this series is trying to do. It's pretend there's no mystique about Moldbug. Just look at the content, look at the connections you can draw from it, and then see what comes up.
And yeah, I think it is often B, and often what you get too is like, oh, we don't need to throw out all of Moldbug, or oh, this point he has is really good about the media or the cathedral or something like that. But that's just beside the point. Like, the point isn't that he has nothing to offer or that none of his ideas are useful. It's that taking a broader perspective on his content as a whole, like, what really is this guy about? What is he trying to do? It matters. It matters a lot whether or not he's trying to seduce the left or the right, and whether or not he's trying to help or hurt the right. I mean, to me, that's obviously a thing that we should figure out once and for all about this person who sort of has an inordinate amount of influence, among our general community. But yeah, it's often just that there's this nostalgia for it, or people's view of Moldbug are just sort of these like one-liners or abstract concepts, divorced of their actual context within his essays.
So, Logos, do you have any thoughts on anything you want to ask Charlie?
Sure, I've been writing down some more questions. So, the first question, kind of rewinding it back a bit, because you guys were kind of talking and I had a question, but I didn't want to jump in. let's take the Supreme Court example, because you thought that was a really good counterexample to Moldbug about how like the right can get things done. Now, Moldbug will say something like, well, unless we secure real power, the left can undo power, and so on and so forth. Now, what do you think about this? This is something I've thought about when reading Moldbug and looking at his recent essays and whatnot. Is getting the left to play their hand too quickly and too early a valid tactic for the right? Like, I think let's suppose that Moldbug's Dark Elf thesis is kind of true in the sense that you win by convincing the right people that the left is driving things off the rails. Now, you can talk to people at dinner parties and, hushed whispers and seduce them through media and whatever you want to do. At the end of the day, the best way I think to approach this is to get the left to do something so quickly and so insane that almost any normal person is going to look at that and just go, whoa, that escalated really quickly. Was this what they were planning all along, like 10 years down the road or something like that? So even if the Dark Elf thesis is correct, and even if Moldbug is saying like the left's just going to completely judo your power in the Supreme Court, they're going to pack the court, they're going to do all sorts of stuff to stop these rulings, they're going to do all this terrible stuff. It seems to me for the right that getting the left to do as much of that as they can as quickly as possible to really show people what's going on and like what we're up against, that itself is the victory, because at that point there's just like no hiding the dynamics of what's going on. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that process has sort of demonstrably happened in the last few years, and it's what is getting people you might consider to be these dark elves like Elon Musk to, react in pretty strong ways to try and curtail the left. Now, whether or not you want that to happen is up in the air, but I think that reaction against the far left, as we conceptualize it as like the woke or whatever, that's happened not because like Yarvin has like seduced them or whatever. It's because the left is acting so ridiculous and extreme and contrary to their ability to make money that they're having sort of natural self-interest reaction. It really has nothing to do with the right, and it has nothing to do with quote unquote dark elves like seducing people, whatever the heck that even means.
I just want to quickly interject real quick here. The idea of provoking the stronger power to overreact to build support throughout the community is absolutely a valid tactic of the weak. All guerrilla movements throughout history have sought to do this. You try to get the ruling power to overreact to kill a bunch of peasants to try to kill you, which then wins the peasants to your side.
But it's just funny when you phrase it that way, because it's like, yeah, Yarvin's whole argument is like, don't provoke the left because then they'll hurt you. But it's like that's how the weaker parties win, is they make the strong party hurt them, and that sucks, right? But that's what you do as a guerrilla faction, is you get the strong man to hurt you enough times to where people are fed up with it. Like, you don't really win any other way.
Yep. I'll go ahead, Logos.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think we all agree there. It's pretty, I don't know. I don't know how anybody could listen to what Moldbug is saying and just not think about it. I mean, even if you don't think about it from the military guerrilla warfare side of things, just think of it like this. Just use the boiling water analogy that people always used when Trump was running for office. Some people thought that Trump was the boiling water and conservatism was the frog. Some people think that the left, cranking things up in America is the boiling water and conservatism is the frog. Whatever. But I mean, let's suppose that the left has a plan for what they want to do with America, as any political faction would have a plan for what they want to do with America if they can get power. Obviously, if you do too much at once, you're not going to have plausible deniability. Like half it's plausible deniability. A small fraction of it is, the elites don't want people to know how much they're in charge. But another part of it is you really don't want people to know the full extent of your plan all at once. Like, just looking at the slippery slope thing for like gay marriage, right? Gay marriage in 2012 is hotly debated. It's, whatever. And then not even 4 years later, 2016, we're starting to see like trans stuff. Now, what if, just hypothetically going back in time, what if we could take all the most radical trans stuff we've got going on right now, chest feeding, like chemically inducing like men to expel something. I don't even know. It's bizarre. Take the most bizarre stuff we've got going on right now, shove it in the political consciousness of 2008, right? Take 8 years, 15 years of this, jam it all at once into 2008. What do you think happens?
Oh, I mean, the left would suffer a complete and total electoral loss.
Yeah, that's been my thought as well. And so I think the right's catching on to that, and Moldbug didn't like it. So like even if the left comes down hard, you want them to come down hard. You want them to come down so hard they are forced to do 15 years of political quote progress in 1 year, and that's the only way people are going to go. Yeah, we know what's going on here. We're putting a stop to this. Okay, so yeah, that was one question, and it looks like we're all in agreement. The next question I had was you were talking about how unclear you are of Moldbug's description of the world, and I agree. My question here is, I think this has to do with Moldbug's insistence to ignore normativity and political oughts about how society ought to be structured, who ought to own what, and so on. I think that's what makes his description unclear. And I've been thinking about this a little passively over the last few weeks. I dislike libertarians a lot. I dislike Moldbug more than I dislike libertarians, because libertarians, though I disagree with them, at least have a positive vision for what they want for the world. So, you know what your enemy is planning in a sense. Moldbug pretends to be like anormative in the sense that we're just going to ignore all oughts and reveal who has power and so on and so forth. And nobody really believes that. In fact, I don't even think people believe that Moldbug believes that at the end of the day. How would you describe this relationship between Moldbug's ignoring ought problems, his political philosophy, and how much that aids in making Moldbug himself unclear?
Well, I think it makes him unclear because, like you said, there's no such thing as a value-free analysis. This is something that my friend Academic Agent has been doing the last several years, where he got really into elite theory, along with myself. We sort of did that together, and we did that kind of because of Moldbug. But he often talks about the idea of a value-free analysis, and elite theory sort of tries to be that, and probably is the best possible attempt at that. But in reality, in the real world, which Yarvin does not live in, there's no such thing as a value-free analysis. Every person has values. Those values are going to work their way into your political philosophy inevitably, no matter how much you try and justify that they haven't. And that sort of leads to his work being a bit unclear, because it feels like he's sort of playing hide the ball a bit with you the whole time, where he has some sort of real positive beliefs about how the world should be organized, but he pretends like he doesn't. And it sort of it leaves this sort of layer of kind of dishonesty across everything, because in general you would rather just people be open about what they want, and we know he wants something, and you're sitting here trying to read between the lines or find these particular quotes about like the Council on Foreign Relations or something. You're trying to find these little one-liners buried within pages and pages of blogs to try and actually put together like what he actually is. You guys have described him as a Stirnerite, and yeah, when you don't know where someone's coming from, it's hard to contextualize what their worldview is, because you need to know what someone wants in order to understand why they're telling you the world should be organized this way, or this is the better way to win at politics. Did that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me. The last question I had, since you brought up Academic Agent, and you also brought up people taking some things that like on a Moldbug, like the Cathedral. I've heard Academic Agent talk about the octopus, but I haven't got to watch a whole bunch of it recently. What do you think now, in hindsight, about Moldbug's description of the Cathedral? I think you've seen kind of what me and Todd think about it, but I'm curious about your perspective. What do you think about the Cathedral? Can you describe briefly AA's version of the octopus, how that relates, what you think about the whole disagreement?
Well, I think the octopus is a better model. I don't remember all 8 limbs or whatever it had, but the Cathedral was just sort of one of them in there. I mean, Yarvin comes up with this idea that there's this sort of religion that lives in the universities and is promulgated by the media, and they exist in this sort of symbiotic relationship. That's kind of like the long and short of power. And Yarvin even wrote a piece against Academic Agent after a conversation they had in person at the Ingrid event where he talked about how money has no power at all, right? And obviously, AA correctly, completely disagrees with this. I mean, Yarvin's cathedral concept is just extremely incomplete in terms of how what the power center of the state actually is. I mean, it's definitely a useful concept to understand. It's probably one of his better concepts just in terms of framing the universities as a religion, and kind of showing us that the media has more power over the state than the formal branches of government. Like, I think it's the press doesn't run the state, but it's easy to see how the press has way more power than Congress. But the cathedral has to be put into some larger context, like the octopus model that takes into account the NGOs, the financial power in particular, with which Moldbug just kind of claims doesn't exist somehow, as well as like corporations in general.
So the octopus, let me see if I get this right. So the octopus has like a head at the center, and this head at the center is probably some kind of financial power. So it's all the people that donate to NGOs, Soroses and the Adelsons and all these people, the big money people at the top. And each of the legs of the octopus are kind of like where the money can divert. So like one leg might be the media and one leg might be academia, especially when you look at like research grants, things like that. One leg might be NGOs, one leg might be the military or something like that. Is that the rough idea?
I think so. I mean, I guess as you lay that out, let's imagine it this way. Let's say you had the power to like remove one part of this octopus. Let's say you could snap your fingers and make all universities, period, all accredited universities just disappear instantly. Imagine you could use the wand of Nargle or whatever and just make that happen. Also, another thing you could do is you could take the account balance of every single bank account of all of these people and institutions and set them to zero. Which thing do you think would have more impact on their power? Erasing the universities or erasing all of their money?
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
So, I mean, yeah, that really frames the cathedral pretty well there.
All right. I want to get to the super we have here. Nerve AMV maker for $10 on Moldbug's appeal. People on the right are attracted to leftists who agree with them on a few issues. That's the reason a Glenn Greenwald gets more Fox News airtime than a Pat Buchanan. Thoughts, Charlie, then Logos.
Could you put the question back up on the screen?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, you see this happening. You see this happening almost constantly on Twitter, where whether it's that Michael Tracy guy or various people that the distributist tries to talk to or whatever, we're just obsessed with leftists who agree with us, and then you always find out that while they may agree with you in some general sense, like that Ian Miles Chung guy or whatever, ultimately they're just going to stab you in the back. It's not even hard to see. I mean, people really need to just block these people on Twitter, and otherwise just not engage with them. I mean, there's no reason to talk to them anyway. I mean, here's the thing: the center is where things are moving. The center is the only people you really ought to be talking to, because I think it's clear that this sort of center, be it like a Blairite center in England or this sort of Donald Trump, Elon Musk, whatever center that's emerging in America, it's going to displace both the left and the right. And those people are very powerful. They're going to displace the far left to some extent for us. So why should we bother talking to these people? We should be interested in people who are legitimately more center liberal within the perspective, because these are the next people who are going to have the choice of oppressing us or not. And it would be better to convince them to oppress the far left more than the right. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, Logos.
I had a question that I was thinking of that when me and Charlie were talking, and then I lost it. So I'm going to have to take a second and try to remember what it was.
Well, I meant on the super chat. Sorry.
Oh, on the super chat. Okay, yeah. I think it's true in a novelty sense. I think a really good example is also like Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore and Tucker have like a frenemy relationship at this point, which is really interesting to watch. I think there are two dynamics. I think it's really complicated. There are two dynamics. You could have a real frenemy dynamic, an organic one. And a good example of this would be like Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich. Those two vehemently agree on foreign policy, and they will work together to do whatever it takes, move heaven and earth to stop the military-industrial complex and get us out of other countries. They just stalwart allies in that. They might disagree on all other social issues, but on that one, they'll come to the table and they'll just be a wrecking ball. That would be like a real frenemy alliance that can happen, at least on issues. And I think those can be healthy as long as people understand the issues where people can work together and they can compartmentalize the issues where it's like, we know we're going to be enemies the second we step outside this arena. We're not going to believe that because we're friends here, we're friends everywhere. The other kind of issue that happens, which I think that the super chat guy was getting at, was like the Dave McManus thing. Like Dave's obsession with McManus and other leftists, where you invite them on because they're reasonable, they're not going to like screech at you, and it's a really good idea to get insight into like how your enemy thinks. And I believe this comes from the genuine place of like, if you understand how your enemy truly thinks, you might be able to either convince them out of it or predict their next moves, or there's some tactical advantage to be gained from it. I think at this point, I agree with Charlie. We've probably seen enough that maybe it's just not even necessary. Within like 15 minutes of David McManus's conversation, I roughly got McManus's whole like arc there, his deontology, all the rest of it. And I'm like, okay, I know what he's getting at. I don't need like 3 hours of this. And I think it's gonna be quicker and quicker and quicker to kind of categorize leftists that you talk to and about and stuff. So I think that's true. With regard to Moldbug, though, I'm kind of confused, because it's like it's not clear that Moldbug is like obviously a leftist. He's not going around preaching egalitarianism. He's not, one of the woke. He's more libertarian leaning than anything else, and he's libertarian leaning with some edgy views about the cathedral and government power and things like that, which we've already talked about. And I think that's the reason why he's interesting. Like, I didn't go to Schilling's. I was talking with Todd about it after he went, and like there's like a really big contingency of libertarians at the event. So asking why the right keeps Moldbug around, to me, is kind of like asking, why does the right keep libertarians around? And then why would the right keep like really, really esoteric, edgy libertarians around? And it seems to me that Moldbug has more of that relationship with the right than, like a Glenn Greenwald on Fox News relationship. But that's just how I see it.
All right. We have another super chat from Nathan C.J. Hood for 5 English pounds. Thank you. Yarvin goes on about being cool to win like the punks. When did the punks win, though? Has being cool ever won? Draw us in as we want to be cool. Yeah,
this is good.
Yeah. So I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Charlie and Logos. It's basically the story that like the corporate media told us about the 60s and 70s. The 60s and 70s were all ersatz, deep state on the one hand, and megacorps on the other hand, trying to create counter gangs locked in a frozen conflict called the Culture War. Because in the 40s and 50s, there was no Culture War. The Americans were very much aligned on social and cultural issues, whether they're Democrat or Republican. The 60s and 70s happened in order to create TLDR, there was a strong labor movement organized, bipartisan, against the Wall Street interests. And they reached their heyday under FDR and Truman. And so in order to break up the country so that it would be easier to control rather than being homogenous, they created all of these counter gangs and frozen conflicts. And so, no, being cool wasn't what won. They were on the side of the stronger horse and just weren't being honest with us. Charlie.
Yeah, well, this is something that people have just bought into again. So I'm glad he brought this up, because I wanted to. I mean, one thing Yarvin's been doing a lot lately is just like throwing parties, basically, and you just have this idea that you win if you're cool. The whole idea of like getting power is just being cool. So if you have parties where they're like hot girls and stuff, and everyone's just cool, like somehow you win. But that's not how power works. That's like a byproduct of power, is being able to have fancy parties and be into like, I don't know, punk rock or whatever. Like that's not how you get. It's literally just causally reversed. And I mean, look, if you're just like you have this concept called like right-wing art hoes who apparently show up to Yarvin's events and other stuff like Dime Square, and it's like, look, if you're just like horny and want to hook up with quote unquote right-wing art hoes, just admit it. Don't try to sell me that like this is how you get into power, because this is just hippie nonsense. Like I don't like, I'm not gonna, abuse anyone for wanting to go to fun parties. As far as I know, Yarvin's a great guy. He's really fun. He's fun to hang out with and talk to. I'm sure he throws great parties, but like this has nothing to do with like how we actually get any power or protect ourselves from power. So yeah, once again, it's just another one of those things from Yarvin that people just take as gospel, even though it's not been demonstrated at all. Like what Hood says there is basically the long and short of it. Like I don't think Moldbug ever actually gives an argument for why being cool makes you win.
Okay, Logos.
This might be a little boomer con at this point, given how Twitter memes evolve, but you see that meme going around all the time, right? Rage Against the Machine, now Rage is for the machine. Even if you take the view that the punks can win and shift culture even in the short run, it doesn't take them very long to be captured by culture. So it's not clear that over the long run anybody wins using those tactics, even if we were to give like everything we can to the argument. You have to distinguish between short run victories and long run victories, and you might be able to push the envelope a little in the short run, but in the long run, culture always just catches up with you and just grabs you in its clutches, just like everybody else. So it's not enough to be edgy and countercultural. You have to do a meta analysis on how culture enforces its values. And I think the reason why it comes for us all, even the punks, is because once the punks have something to lose, once they get money, assets, a reputation, things like that, I think the reputation is really the big one.
Like the yippies. Think of the yippies.
Exactly, yeah. Once you start getting those things, once you start having those things to lose, is exactly when culture, those who control it, can threaten to steal them from you. And so you'll never be really countercultural without being counter those institutions writ large. The only way you're going to truly be a punk, and given my profile on Twitter, that this is just tongue in cheek and obvious. The only way to be a countercultural icon is to be a Diogenes, not a Rage Against the Machine.
Well, all right, guys. I think we covered everything, unless you remember that question, Logos.
Unfortunately, no. Like I said in the chat, I'm going to have to rewatch our conversation because I was thinking of something right when we were talking, and I'm like, oh, that reminds me, we got to follow up. And then a bunch of stuff happened, and I lost my train of thought before I could type in a notepad, and I'm kicking myself. But I'll remember it when I rewatch the video, kind of like when I wrote that essay for Dave. And I'll send it to you, and you can send it to him later.
All right. Well, thank you, Charlie, for coming on. It was a pleasure talking to you about Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. Where can people find you and your content?
Charlemagne.substack.com, and also if you go to findmyfriends.net, you can find all of my and my friends' content there. And also my YouTube channel is just Charlemagne as well. So that's it. Oh, and the Old Glory Club as well, oldgloryclub.substack.com. That's where I'm doing a lot of my main writing right now. I have an article coming out on Monday on the titles Toward a Low Entropy Right. So, yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a good conversation.
All right. Yeah, thanks again, Charlie. Thanks again, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the President Fly Podcast signing off.